I wanted to start today by just giving a very brief overview about mediumship research and some of the major questions that have been explored thus far. So, mediumship channeling is a global human experience. There was a very interesting study done about 50 years ago, polling 488 societies and asking about spirit possession, or what some people might call channeling, and 74% of those societies said that yes, they had some belief in that. And we see in many cultures around the world that this belief and experiences of mediumship channeling are embedded in their cultures. And these experiences have been recorded for as long as we have written history. And move forward now to modern day, and mediumship permeates our modern culture, from Tyler Henry, Long Island Medium, John Edwards, Edward Hicks. You see this all over in reality TV shows, but also in fiction as well. So how common is mediumship, or the experience of mediumship? We polled about almost 3,000 people and asked them if they had an experience of communicating with the spirits or the dead, and 44% of those people actually said yes. And these were Institute of Noetic Sciences members, so you could say perhaps it was a skewed population. We also did another study survey with about 900 people, and this was a unique group in that it was with people from the general population, so not IONS members, scientists and engineers and enthusiasts, and overall 53% said that they had felt that they were in contact with someone who had died. Studies specifically about this question about if you've had contact with the dead has been asked around the world for the past 50 years or so, and you see various prevalence here, from as low as maybe 5% in USA to as high as over 40%, some surveys in Iceland. So this is a common human experience. You talk to some people and they'd say, okay, well, this is actually a psychopathology, this isn't normal. What is the research that's been done around that? So in general, most of the studies that have looked at psychopathology find that there are no pathological dissociative or psychotic symptoms in people who experience contact with the dead or mediumship. Most of the studies also show that they have higher symptoms of dissociation and psychosis, but not at clinical levels. For the most part, they remember the experience, they're highly functional in their life and socially well adjusted. What we do see is that when the experiences are very frequent and very strong, and there's not a lot of social support, that it moves into the pathological. But for the most part, it is non-pathological, that these people who are having these mediumship experiences. We also see in numerous studies that it imparts benefit. People rate that their mediumship experiences have a positive impact on their lives. It supports their well-being. It allows them to have a valuable role in their communities, especially if mediumship is part of the culture. It provides a therapeutic function. There have been some more recent studies looking at the grieving process and how mediumship can support people with grieving. Another question that's been asked is the information that comes through mediumship actually true and verifiable? Can we actually know things from beyond death? There's a long, long history of survival research and collecting data about this. More recently, we have evidential mediumship studies with triple-blind methods and growing evidence for above-chance results that, yes, some of the information coming through is true and couldn't be known through traditional means. Now, some of the speakers today are going to be talking about this research question, so we can look forward to learning more about that. Another major question that's been asked is, well, how does it work? What's actually going on when people are experiencing mediumship or channeling? There have been a number of studies looking at physiological correlates and what's happening in the body. There's mixed results around these, so there's no definitive answers in terms of what's happening in the body. In general, many of the studies have shown increased power in alpha, beta, and theta, so there's increased power in the brain. There's an increase in excitatory neurotransmitters, muscle tone, and heart rate. And there are some interesting studies looking at neuroimaging that saw differences between trance and non-trance states. And then more recently, there have also been some interesting studies looking at hormones, specifically DMT, because of this theory around the potential implication of the pineal gland in mediumship. And those were small studies, but they did show negative results, but there's a lot more research that needs to be done in this area. We did a study at our lab looking at channelers and comparing channeling states versus non-channeling states. We actually didn't see a difference in the EEG, but we did do a voice analysis and saw significant differences in frequency of the voice, which is quite interesting. I imagine many of you have actually witnessed trance channelers and observed, the outward changes of their voice, their mannerisms, their parent personality, and so that was an interesting finding. We also did another novel study where we had random number generators placed in the living room of a group channeling weekend, if you will, and we looked at the data from this random number generators when there was no channeling happening and the channelers were sitting in the living room, compared to when they were channeling sitting in the same living room in the same spots. And this was quite fascinating. We did multiple analyses methods and found an increase in the cross correlation of the various RNG channels. And we also looked at mutual information, which was across the channel. So the cross correlation is in the same channel. So we're calling this increased coherence in time, and across the channels was increased coherence in space. Sorry, I can't go into these in more detail. We're doing a big overview, but I'm happy to share references so you can see the papers on these. And yes, sorry, we saw significant changes in those. Another thing that we're trying to do, so, there's all this conversation about terminology, mediumship versus channeling, what's the difference? Some are trance, some are not trance. So what we're trying to do now is actually capture more information about level of consciousness, because many trance channelers aren't actually in a full, complete trance like some old trance channelers did, where they just completely checked out and had no recollection of the experiences. Today, many trance channelers would say, I'm actually observing this experience, and they can still witness it. So we're trying to collect information, subjective information about that in terms of where people are at with their consciousness level and their perception of control of their body. Another question that's been asked is, well, can anyone do this? Can anyone have these experiences? There anecdotally been stories about it running in families. In many of our surveys, we ask, does this run in your family? For people, when we were asking just about mediumship, the majority said yes, it did run in their families. When we asked about people who experienced trance channeling, the majority did not have it run in their families. So it's a mixed bag there. Overwhelmingly, the only common thing is that it's greater in females, which is interesting. There's been one pedigree analysis that found autosomal dominant transmission through family histories, through intensive interviews. And we just published, well, it's actually in press, a study looking at the DNA of 10 high-functioning psychics. So these weren't specifically people who did mediumship, but it did include those as well. And we found one region in the non-protein coding area of the DNA that was significantly different between the psychics and the controls. And what's fascinating about this is that all the psychics had the wild type variant of this area, and 7 out of the 9 controls had a variation. So I invite you to check out that paper when it comes out, because we also did an exploration of various sociogenomic aspects like the spread of Christianity, etc., and found some interesting findings. So the next question people often ask, oh, what is the source? Is this coming from the medium themselves? Is there some separate entity that's actually communicating, a non-physical entity? And there's been numerous work discussing this, and experimental protocols suggested to try to discern whether it's psi or super psi or some psychic reservoir or actual survival of consciousness that is coming through, especially in terms of info on deceased persons. People also have perceptions of what they believe the source is. So we have included this in numerous of our surveys. The numbers I'm showing you here is from one survey of trance channelers specifically, but we've asked these questions of people who have had mediumship experiences and other general psi experiences, and the results are somewhat similar with a little bit of differences. But at the top rises the higher self, so a part of themselves. There's also this concept of group non-physical beings that are communicating. Deceased humans is also up there, universal mind, collective consciousness, etc. And then we have others that are perhaps more rare, like extraterrestrials, plants, animals, etc. I mentioned that group channeling study weekend that we did the focus groups with the 5 group channelers. So we did an in-depth qualitative analysis of that, and there were 21 different purported beings that were coming through during those communications, just to give you a example of the variety of perceived sources that are communicating through trance channelers. And some would argue, well, does the source really matter? Is it really important for us to verify what the source is if it provides meaning, if the content is meaningful to the listener, if it imparts positive impact in the channeler and the medium's life? Is it really important for us to definitively know what the actual source is, and perhaps hold it with a container of, we don't know what the source is, but is the information actually useful? And that leads me to the content, is another question that we're curious about. Is the content that comes through actually useful? There are common major categories of the information that comes through mediumship and channeling. Often it's guidance and personal message, information about the future and the past, healing, ageless wisdom, perennial philosophy, common themes about love and connectedness, information from or about the deceased, creative material, paintings, poems, literature, information about health, descriptions of life in the non-physical world, and scientific and technological material. So I'm going to share with you now about an exploratory study in progress that is really going more deeply into this question about, is this information useful? This is a collaboration with Patricio Tresoldi and his colleagues, and who is a speaker here today. And so our question was, could we actually ask group channelers in a group about more scientifically oriented questions and get useful information from that? So I'm going to share a little bit about how that study is going thus far. So I mentioned this group channeling focus group already that we did, and this was done in Mount Shasta. We were sitting in this living room. We had multiple channeling sessions with the QNG in the corner, and it was quite fascinating because I observed multiple different modes of channeling. So the more traditional one where one person was channeling one purported non-physical being. Then we also had multiple channelers channeling at the same time, different purported beings. And then the most fascinating to me was a sequential process where one channeler channeled one purported being, and then that being communicated, okay, now I'm going to jump to this channeler, and then move to that channeler, continued the conversation, moved to the next channeler, continued the conversation. So this idea of group channeling was really excited as a model for exploring channeling more deeply. And there's perceived benefit in it from the participants. It's also interesting because you can, there's like a synergy across correspondence of the information that's coming through where, they resonate with the information, say, yes, I'm getting that too, or I'm getting this twist, or here's this other piece of information. And we also see that this model has worked really well with remote viewing, this cross correspondence to refine the data coming through. So like I mentioned, could we get useful answers to scientific questions using this group channeling model? So in terms of developing the questions, we put a call out to our colleagues and said, hey, we're doing this project. What questions would you want to ask? And so we came up with 46 questions total and chose to start with 10 of them. And these were just, randomly chosen as ones to begin with. Question about the nature of observation, reincarnation, a pre-life experience. Is there a universal constant? What is matter? Why we forget before we come into this world? What is love? What's the nearest exoplanet with intelligent life? What is the creative force that creates all things, and the nature of dark matter? So we put out a call to our networks to have mediums, channelers apply to participate. 46 people responded. Of those, we went through the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and 15 were invited. They needed to be comfortable with technology, have at least 11 mediumistic sessions, and have a high comfort with channeling scientific information. 7 people actually participated in the sessions. They were all female in our first round, average age of 49, and mixed racial identity, and all of them had actually greater than 50 sessions for the 7 that actually participated. And when we looked at the different channeling types that they endorsed, most of them endorsed doing mediumship and clairaudience, but also chose others as well that they believed they had the capacity of doing. So the way that it worked in COVID times, we did these on Zoom. So we had a research assistant who was observing all the participants in the Zoom session. And what they did first, they were given the question, and then they answered the question in the non-channeling state. So just from their conscious mind, what do they think the answers to these questions are? Then we gave a unique instruction, which was that we invited them to set the intention that they would all connect to the same source. And then we had them answer the questions in the channeling state. They either typed their answers into the chat directly to the RA without the others seeing the answers, or they did an audio recording that was submitted, and then we transcribed the audio recordings. So once we collated all this material, we had 3 judges score the specific research questions that we're asking, and I'll get to that in a minute. And those 3 judges' scores were averaged, and then we also looked at inter-rater reliability for that. So what I found so fascinating was the difference in volume of material. So if we look at this by question, the no channeled answers had much less volume of words. The highest was 500. But you look at the channeled answers, the highest was, and this is characters, so over 3,000 characters. So there was much more volume of information for the channeled answers than the non-channeled answers, and this also varied quite a bit by channeler as well. So our first research question was, what is the correspondence between the channeled answers and the non-channeled answers? And we hypothesized that for the correspondence score, that looking at these, they would have a score of less than 2, which corresponded to, average correspondence. And what we found was that this was true, that yes, when we compared the non-channeled answers to the channeled answers, averaging the judge's score, the correspondence was less than 2. So there were differences between the channeled and the non-channeled. And our inter-rater reliability was moderate for this question. Then we did pairwise comparisons for each of the channeled responses for the channelers. So looking at pairwise for all the channelers' channeled responses. And we hypothesized that the correspondence for this would be greater than 3, so that there would be good correspondence. And that this might vary by question, but overall it would be good. And we did not find this to be so. In fact, the correspondence was actually a little bit less than the channeled versus the non-channeled. There was significant difference across questions, though, where some questions were corresponded more than others. We also did the same analysis for non-channeled responses, and there was higher correspondence in the non-channeled responses than the channeled responses. And again, there was variation by question. So these very unique findings, we're not quite sure what to do with this yet. The other thing we asked them is, what do you perceive the source to be? And because we set the intention that it would be the same source, the hope was that it would be, but we didn't find this to be so. Probably the highest corroboration was that 3 of the channelers mentioned a collective of some sort was their source. But besides that, there was really no overlap. There were 12 different sources listed, and I just listed a few of them here. So in terms of, what we do with this in the next steps, what we also want to look at are the thematic analysis. What are the themes that actually came through across the channelers? And we're going to do that in a manual way. We also want to see if any of the pieces of information that came through can actually be verified or tested in any way. We're also exploring automated types of qualitative analysis. These are, my exploration with a program called Lexamancer, looking at one of the questions. This is your concept maps, and this is the data from the US versus the data in Italy. And, they look quite different, but these are another interesting way that we want to explore. So in terms of next steps, like I mentioned, we're going to do this thematic analysis, automated text analysis. I've also emailed the scientists whose questions were included in this to ask them, hey, do these answers make any sense to you? Do you think they're useful in any way? Can you test them in any way? And we also just completed sessions for a second set of questions on climate change. So we're going to see what those climate change answers look like as well. In terms of the previous studies that I mentioned, we're still looking at EEG in terms of an interconnectivity analysis. We're continuing our program looking at genetic analysis, not just for mediumship, but for various types of psi experiences. And then I think it is really important to continue exploring people's subjective experience about this and the meaning and the impact, the benefits that people experience regardless of the source, regardless of the veracity. So that is the end of my formal talk. Deep, deep gratitude to our funders, to all the people who have supported these many, many studies. I know I've given a very top level overview of these. I'm happy to share the published papers that go into the methods and details of all these